The ancient Romans and Egyptians fashioned artificial eyes out of painted clay. By the 1500s, Europeans started making them out of enameled gold, and soon out of glass, which remained the norm for hundreds of years. Today, most artificial eyes are made of acrylic. If you've lost an eye in an accident or to a disease, a specialist known as an ocularist can fit you with an artificial eye. You can get a ready-made model or a custom-made prosthesis like the one for which this patient's being fitted. No two people's eye sockets are the same, so the first step is to take an impression. After inserting the impression tray, they inject a material called alginate, filling the entire socket cavity. After 90 seconds, the alginate sets, and they can remove the hardened impression. They place the impression in a mold and pour in a type of plaster. When the plaster has hardened, they remove the impression tray and then the impression itself. What's left in the mold is a plaster replica of the socket. Now they put a wad of acrylic plastic dough into the mold, lock the mold into a press, and submerge it in a high-pressure curing unit for 25 minutes. Then they cool the mold in cold water. Here's the original impression compared to the acrylic model they've just cast. This model is called the fitting shape because they use it to fit and mark the positioning of the fake iris. They accentuate the markings, then attach a peg with a drop of wax. The peg indicates the natural angle of the iris when the patient is looking forward. Next, they add wax around the perimeter to enlarge the fitting shape. This excess will give the ocularist some play afterwards for the final sizing. Now they take this marked and enlarged fitting shape and make a plaster mold. They'll later use that mold to cast the actual artificial eye. But first, they have to make the iris. They take a curved black acrylic disc and paint it as realistically as possible with high-quality artist's oils. The patient has to be present so they can match the real eye. Next, they glue an acrylic cornea with an appropriate size pupil onto the painted iris. At this point, the artificial iris is 13 millimeters in diameter. If the patient's real iris is smaller, they trim down the replica to match. The iris then goes into the plaster mold, covered with white acrylic dough. After the same high-pressure curing process as before, out comes the artificial eye, covered with excess white acrylic. They trim off that excess and the peg, using a grinding tool and a cutter. This refines the shape and exposes the iris buried underneath. They smooth the surface against a grinding stone and verify the measurements. Then, using hard coloring pencils, they add finishing touches to the iris and draw blood vessels. They label the eye with the patient's initials, then apply an acrylic coating to seal the pencil marks. To create veins with some dimension, they use the same acrylic coating to stick on some delicate silk threads. Once they're satisfied the artificial eye is a perfect match, they seal the artwork with another acrylic coating. Once that cures, they polish the eye to a shine with a cotton wheel. The shapes and colors of artificial eyes are endless because patients' eye sockets and irises greatly vary, as do their scleras, the white of the eye. This artificial eye, or ocular prosthesis, is ready. The final step is to ensure that the fit is perfect. The patient's ocular muscles attach to the implant, enabling his artificial eye to move in unison with his real eye. The violin developed in the 1500s, evolving from a series of guitar-like instruments that musicians played with a bow. While the violin is best known for classical music and gypsy music, today you hear it in pop, country, bluegrass, and even jazz. First, they cut a piece of maple, then split it in half to expose the grain in mirror image. They melt down glue flakes made from animal hide, then bond the pieces together. Violin makers use only glue, never nails or screws. These pieces of wood will form the back of the violin. After 4 hours, the glue is dry and they can remove the clamps. Using a small plane, they even out the surface. Then they trace the violin's shape and cut it out. They shave the surface, sculpting a downward slope from the middle using an even smaller plane. Then they carve a groove along the circumference. After dabbing it with glue, they insert what's known as purfling, a reinforcement made from a thin strip of hardwood, usually maple. Finally, they carve the reverse side to the right form and thickness. Next, they make the sides of the violin, known as the ribs. First, they soak thin strips of maple or sycamore and press them against a heated bending iron to curve them. Then they glue the strips around a form, connecting them at the top and bottom and at the corners with small blocks of wood. They clamp everything together and let the glue dry for 4 hours. Next, they glue thin strips of wood, called counter ribs, onto the edge of the ribs. This enlarges the surface so that it's easier to glue the ribs in the back together. They make the violin's front, or belly, from a solid piece of spruce. To the underside, they glue a spruce support bar called the bass bar. Sound escapes through the 2 curved slots called F-holes. They cut out and carve the violin's neck and scrolled head from a piece of maple. Then they glue it to the body. They sculpt the fingerboard from ebony, a hard wood that's durable enough to withstand centuries of violinists' fingering. Using a tool called a peg hole reamer, they make holes for the ebony or rosewood pegs around which the strings are wound. They coat the wood with 4 or 5 coats of varnish, depending on the color, then polish it with several coats of oil over several days until the finish is shiny and silky smooth. Next, they insert the sound post. This little pine cylinder conducts sound and supports the belly against bowing pressure, so it's critical to position it in precisely the right spot between the belly and the back. It's not glued, but rather wedged into place. The bridge isn't glued either. It's held in place by the pressure of the 4 strings, which they feed through the ebony tailpiece and wind onto the pegs. The bridge has little notches in which the strings sit. The violin is finished. They make the bow from horsehair and a high-quality Brazilian wood called Pernambuco. They bind the hairs at one end with a strong sewing thread, then burn them and seal them with wax to prevent fraying. This end goes into the frog, the wooden box at the bottom or heel of the bow. They cover the frog with a mother-of-pearl lining, then slip on a ring made of nickel, silver, or gold to prevent the hairs from tangling. Next comes the screw that controls the tension of the hairs. They comb the hairs to make them parallel, then insert them into the tip of the bow, known as the head. They tighten the screw until the hairs are taut. Finally, they rub on rosin, a sticky pine tree resin that keeps the bow from slipping off the strings.